Hello everyone, my name's Dan, back with Your Average Med Students, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about a guide to the medical school for incoming medical students. As of this recording, this is from 2025 to 2026 for the academic year. And in this video, I'm going to be providing you guys with some tips and advice I wish I had known when I started medical school. So, the very first thing I want to emphasize very early on is the importance of building a really good study routine. Study routine. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, one of the first things that comes with building a good study routine is, of course, having a consistent bedtime. So what this looks like is, of course, going to bed around 10 to 11 p.m. Obviously, not every student can do this, and waking up sometime between 6 to 7 a.m. Obviously, earlier the better, but the importance is having a consistent bedtime and trying to achieve a reasonable amount of hours of sleep every single day. And the reason why, in a nutshell, is because the hours of sleep that you get is directly proportional to your performance on the following day. Performance. Okay. The next thing that comes with building a good study routine is studying viciously as much as you can. And when I say viciously, I mean study really, really hard, even in the first 2 years of medical school, because, as you know, medicine is a really, really broad subject that continuously builds upon itself, right? So, for example, if you study really hard for step one, oftentimes that performance translates to something like step 2 CK. As you can see, these exams are called steps. You take the first step, you take the second step, and the third step. All of this content builds upon each other. So it's very important for students to do really well in their preclinical year, because oftentimes it translates to higher performance on exams like Step 2 CK and, of course, in your clinical rotations. So for me personally, the first 2 years of my medical education, I really always try to go to bed at 10 p.m. because, of course, as I understood that the hours of sleep I got was correlated with the performance of my mindset the following day. So I always went to bed to 10 p.m., try to wake up at 6 to 7 a.m. every single day. Trying to get that consistent routine is crucial. And for me, this is going to jump a little bit into the next subject, but for me, I was more of an Anki user. So I always understood that I always try to do Anki first thing in the morning because it was when my mind was at its sharpest, and I would watch lectures during the middle of the day and finish the day with learning new cards. So that's kind of what worked for me. And the important point I want to drive home is you want to stick with that study routine and follow it consistently. Never deviate from the study routine, because if you deviate, you don't gain as much effectiveness from the study routine. Consistency is absolutely crucial. The next thing I want to talk about is a little bit about study strategy. And I know in our videos, in case you've seen them, we talk a lot about Anki. We talked a lot about Google Spreadsheets. So I'm just going to touch a tad bit on that, since studying is probably 90% of what you're going to be doing as a medical student. So a lot of times what ends up happening is people start with one strategy. They'll try it for, like, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks before jumping into a new strategy. They'll try it for another 2 to 3 months and end up with a new strategy. Now, the problem with this, and is something I alluded to previously, is that study strategies really depend on being consistent and sticking with the strategy. So, for example, if you think about Anki, right? Anki has a lot of reviews, a lot of active learning. It's all about keeping up with your cards. If you do Anki for only, say, 1 month or 1.5 months, you're not really going to be reaping the benefits that you get with Anki in the long term. The beauty of Anki is a spaced repetition and being able to keep up with a large amount of content over a long period of time. So Anki isn't really an effective tool in the short term. It's more something you do for the long term. It's something you stick to for a longer duration of time. So let's touch base a little bit on sort of the three strategies that I've really, rather two strategies actually. Obviously, the first thing is Anki. We have videos on that. But a couple of points I want to make for incoming medical students is to always, always do your reviews every single day. Keep your streaks going even if you have no time in the world, because as I've come to understand it, and a lot of people who build apps, a lot of people who, for example, do Duolingo, having a streak is probably the most important motivator for individuals to continue keeping up with something. For medical students in this case, it is the most important motivator for people to continue doing their Anki cards. Let me just paint an example of how critical this is, and a time in my life where I was on the verge of losing my streak. So the story was that essentially we just finished our exam. Ryan and I finished our exam in the first year of medical school, and we went on vacation afterwards, obviously, into the great city of New York City. And I think it was around 11:50 p.m. when I realized that I didn't actually do my Anki cards for the day. And I saw that my streak was about to end because I didn't do my card. Obviously, at that very moment in time, it was very difficult for me to have done the Anki card. I just finished the exam. There was no new material for me to learn, etc. But even in the face of those obstacles, I still opened up the app to try and get at least one card in during the day. And that was sort of what helped keep up my streak in the first year. And to this day, I don't regret that at all. I think keeping up with your streaks and always doing your reviews is so important for Anki, because it motivates you to keep on doing the cards. Next thing, of course, is the Google spreadsheet method. This is actually a very popular method for Ryan. So I have a video on this. If you look in our channel, you can see the video on the Google spreadsheet method. But basically, if in case you've never used Google spreadsheet, it's basically the same as Microsoft Excel. Basically, the way it works is that in the cells you have two columns. You have column A, column B, and in column A you write a question, and then in column B you have the answer. Again, another column. Column A, you have a question. Column B, you have an answer. Column A, another question. Column B, another answer. So this is actually a really good method for people who are more visual-based learners and people that don't really enjoy using Anki and having that strict, rigid, active learning schedule. So with the Google spreadsheet, you use color codes to sort of tell you how well you know a certain topic or a certain card on column A or column B. So when you write down these questions and answers from materials you've learned, like in lecture, you would black out column B with the blackout function, not erase. And then you go through it. You go through question A, column A, this question over here, column A, this question here, and column A, this question over here. And then you color code it as you go through. So for example, maybe this question, I got it correct. Gonna highlight it in green. The question below it, maybe I did know it, but it's a little bit difficult. Gonna call it yellow. And let's say the last question, I didn't know it at all. Gonna color it red. So that at the end, you have this nice visual column of different colors that allows you to see from a bird's eye view which topic you struggle with and what topics you excel with. It's just another unique way for people to sort of study their material, but definitely Anki is the way to go for the majority of medical students, I would say. But this is to say that everyone has a different study strategy. Whatever you find works for you. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to actually stick with it. All right, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is shadowing, and this is actually extremely critical for students in the first year and the second year. So in fields such as like dermatology, plastic surgery, orthopedic surgery, you name it, these fields often reward students who demonstrate longitudinal interests in the field very early on, like in the first year and second year. So the consequence of that is that it's very advantageous for students to demonstrate interest in these fields early on by knowing that they want to go into these fields very early on. For some people, they've explored these fields before medical school in the form of volunteering and actual jobs, such as like medical assistants, so they already know they want to go into these fields. That's very valuable, but if you're in the cohort that didn't take gap years or didn't like the field that they were working in before medical school, it's very important for people to start shadowing very early on so they can develop an interest in a certain field early on. So obviously the advantages of shadowing is twofold, right? Well, threefold technically, but first of all, you gain an appreciation for the field that you're interested in going to. Second of all, you also know very early on if this is a field you like. So the benefit here is the early exposure and the demonstration of early interest. Obviously for applying for residency. And shadowing in general just helps you improve your clinical knowledge. So that's always a plus. So shadowing for me, in my opinion, is the most important thing you can do first and second year, aside from developing a very rigid and structured study routine that you stick to for a long duration of time. So for shadowing very early on, I would recommend reaching out to faculty members at your home institution to do some shadowing. If your institution doesn't have a home program, finding anybody to shadow in that field is super important. Dermatology, plastic surgery, orthosurgery, you name it. Let me tell you a story briefly about a couple of my colleagues, actually. I had a couple of my colleagues who thought they wanted to do surgery very early on in the first and second year of medical school. So, as you might imagine, they did research in the surgical field. It's a surgical subspecialty, so they did a lot of interest groups and whatnot. All really good stuff for a residency application. Then when it came time to actually apply into the surgical subspecialty, they would reflect back on their clinical rotations and realize that, maybe surgery was not for them. And this is a very, very, very common thing that actually happens in medical school. People think they want to do a certain field, then they actually rotate in the field and decide that they don't want to do it. So the best way to circumvent this is to obviously do a ton of shadowing. If you're interested in dermatology, shadow dermatologist attending, but also shadow a dermatology resident, right? Resident, because in any field, you're going to be spending a considerable amount of time as a resident. You have to ask yourself, when I'm 30, 35, 40 years old, do I want to be spending a considerable amount of my time being a resident in this field, doing the long hours, the bureaucratic work, etc. But also understanding that there's a light at the end of the tunnel as an attending and asking yourself, okay, after I've done my training, as an attending, is this a position I see myself 5 to 10 years after residency? Is this something I like? So getting a sense of those questions and answers is super critical very, very early on for early medical students. And then obviously when you have this early interest in a field, doing things like volunteering in the field, doing things like research in the field, developing mentors in the field, all of these are crucial very early on, because you want to be spending the majority of your time in MS1, MS2, getting these stuff done so that when MS3 comes around, you can focus on the more academic things such as coursework, clinical coursework, so courses, and obviously the dreaded Step 2 CK. Alright, the last thing I'm going to be talking about is research. This is something that a lot of people really, really want to know and really capitalize on early on in their clinical preclinical years. So I'm going to talk about two things. The first thing I really recommend incoming students to do is to develop some sort of computational statistical skill. Computational oops, spelled that wrong. Statistical skill. I know it's very hard to learn a completely different field while you are in the trenches of medical school, especially early on. But I can assure you, in the new generation with things like ChatGPT, it becomes incredibly easy to learn a new skill because you have such a powerful tool to ask questions and to understand new concepts in such a fast amount of time. So, computational statistical, why do we need to know this? Well, because a lot of research these days involve computationally heavy statistics that a lot of PIs, professors and doctors, don't have the knowledge to do on their own. So oftentimes they employ either students who know these skills or biostatisticians who specialize in these skills. So, one of the things you can do that you can offer as a medical student to prospective research mentor is having this statistical skill for their research projects. Personally, for me, I spent about 6 months or so within my first year of medical school just picking up and learning some basic R. This was something I did as a hobby in addition to my medical school coursework, which was a lot of time, but I believe this seriously paid off, and I do not regret spending this amount of time learning R and statistics because it paid off with the amount of research I was able to conduct for my 4 to 5 years in medical school. So for computational statistical skills, the three big things I've seen is Stata, people learning Stata, people learning R, people learning Python. These are all different tools and software that you can look at to help you compute statistics. Obviously, well, technically, there's also like being really good at Excel, but I'd say the biggest one is learning Stata, R, or Python. Stata is something that a lot of, some of the older PIs are more familiar with. So if you learn Stata and you come across a PI who knows Stata, you might be able to have some help over there. For me, I chose to learn R because R is a very intuitive program for people to learn statistics. And the syntax is a lot easier, in my personal opinion, for statistics than Python. Obviously, Python, you probably heard of it. It's a very general computing software, computer programming software that not only can do statistics, but can do a variety of other tasks, automating tasks, developing web applications, etc. So it's a very powerful tool. But I'd say as a medical student research, most of the time you're going to be doing statistics. That's where R comes in very handy. Obviously, we've talked about ChatGPT. ChatGPT has the functionality of doing data analysis. Combined with R and Python and ChatGPT, it becomes incredibly simple for any medical student to spend some time to learn statistical skills. And this will really pay off when you reach out to a professor or a physician, asks, hey, I want to do research. I have these skill sets in R and Python to do statistics. And oftentimes, 9 out of 10, they'll be really impressed that you know how to do that and give you some projects on your own. The second best thing about having these skills is that you can start thinking in a statistical framework, and that allows you to come up with projects on your own that helps you pump out papers because PIs, again, really appreciate people who come up with projects on their own and show initiative. And then finally, the next thing we're going to be talking about is how to actually sort of get involved in research. If you remember, undergraduate probably was very difficult for people to get involved in research, but I would say it's a little bit easier to get involved in research in medical school, which is great. So, there's home institution research mentors, obviously, right? So reach out to them in your field of interest. Reach out to them with an email template you can find to establish a connection very early on. But also you can look into working with research mentors in other institutions that are not within your nearby vicinity. So, for example, my school was on the East Coast. The East Coast. I sent emails out to almost every single, I wouldn't say almost every single, but majority of the programs in my field of interest within the Eastern Coast. But I also reached out to programs in the West Coast who were actually very receptive to my emails. And I got to do some projects with research mentors in the West Coast. So, broaden your scope, broaden your fishing net to really reach out to a variety of research mentors. And the second, and actually the third thing I also want to bring up is, oftentimes in some fields that aren't super research heavy. So, for example, the first thing I think of is radiology. Obviously, research in radiology is not super important compared to dermatology. And it's also a lot more difficult to do research focused in radiology. So oftentimes people who are doing or interested in pursuing radiology, they do research in different fields like dermatology, which have been known to obviously have a lot of lab groups that pump out a lot more papers. In any case, your goal as a first and second year medical student is to get the highest number of indexable pubs you can. And that applies to really, really, really competitive specialties. Dermatology, plastic surgery, research is critical for success. Okay, so to summarize the five things I want to bring home for medical students. The first thing is keeping a consistent study routine, okay? Wake up at the same time every day, go to bed at the same time every day, maximize your sleep, keep up with your good health, exercise when you can, and study viciously. Do your cards, do reviews. Always try to interact with the study material every single day of medical school. The second thing is picking a study strategy and sticking to it. Consistency is absolutely crucial, guys. Pick a study strategy, don't deviate from it. There will be days where you feel like this is a stupid study strategy, but I can assure you that you stick with it, the dividends will pay off. 3, as an early medical student, shadow early on. Figure out what field you're interested in, and once you do that, start getting involved very early on so you can demonstrate to radiology or any other specialty program directors that you're interested in this field. And finally, 4, develop a computational skill. In fields like dermatology, plastic surgery, orthopedic surgery, research is critical, and the one thing you can contribute as a medical student is statistics and computational skills. So very early on, try your best to learn these skills with the help of tools like ChatGPT so you can become an asset to a research team. And finally, number 5, get involved in research early on, obviously, and this involves reaching out to a research mentor within your home institution, but also in institutions across the country. Don't limit yourself into one geographic area. And always, always, always mention that you have a skill set that you can provide to a research team that they don't have otherwise. So I hope this video was helpful to incoming medical students. These are some very broad and very broad strategies that I hope you employ and that will pay off. Until next time, see ya.